Hello, everyone. It's such a delight to be here. I hope it's not as rainy where you are all as it is here in Dublin. But I'm delighted to be here. I'm very honored to be introducing Carl Phillips. I have been a massive admirer of Carl's work for a long time now, and never more so than when I read Scattered Snows to the North, this new collection. Carl, for those of you who don't know, is the author of 16 books of poetry. Most recently, and I would urge you to read this book, Then the War and Selected Poems, which came out from Carcanet in 2022 and has poems from 2007 all the way up to 2020. So if you're looking to read more of Carl's work, that is a great place to start as well. He very deservedly won the Pulitzer Prize in 2023 for that book. I remember when I first read Carl's work, and I experienced one of those rare moments of complete revelation, encountering a voice and a style and a way of thinking that seemed to open up so much possibility that it seemed impossible that I'd ever lived without it. I felt a sense of mystery in the poems, a real glittering intelligence, and a sensibility that I think of as both elegant and exacting. Carl, as I'm sure you'll hear tonight, makes syntax do extraordinary things, elongating and turning and deepening and expanding his poems into unexpected and brilliant places. This latest book, Scattered Snows to the North, has a way of making memory and transience play off against this emotional anchoring. It lends a sort of dreamlike, penetrative atmosphere, I think, to these poems. In some places, I thought redolent of T.S. Eliot's Four Quartets. These are explorations of love and sex and nature, and I'm really excited for you to hear them tonight. Carl's going to read for about 20 to 25 minutes, and then Carl and myself will have a quick conversation. Um, but there's also time, as Jazz mentioned, to ask some of your questions to Carl. And these don't have to be saved until the end. You can drop them into the Q&A box whenever the thought occurs to you. And I will be able to see them there and I'll be able to pitch them to Carl. So if at any point during Carl's reading a question arises, pop it in the Q&A box and I will pitch it to him later. So if you would be kind enough to welcome the wonderful Carl Phillips to read from his new collection, Scattered Snows to the North. Carl, I'll pass over to you and you can blow us all away.
Okay, but no pressure. Thank you so much, Seán, for being willing to do this. And I wish I were in Dublin right now so we could go grab a beer afterwards or something. But here we are on Zoom. And I wanted to thank everyone at Carcanet for making this book possible over there. And particular Michael and John and Jazz, keeping everything organized for me, and Andrew for the beautiful cover. I'm just so honored to be published over in the United Kingdom. And it's still a strange, rare treat for me. So as Seán said, I'm going to read and let's go write down what time it is now. And I'm going to start. Okay, so I was going to read from this book, but I'm going to try being modern and reading off the screen. Let's see if what that does. Okay, this is called Regime. As I took off my clothes, I watched him taking his own off. The sound of rain was for once not the sound of wind shaking the rain steadily loose from a stand of river birch. It's hard to believe in them, the beautiful colors of extinction. But these are the colors. Short and sweet. Also, I wanted to say, I forgot to say, in particular, Seán, thank you so much for that very generous and kind and smart introduction. I particularly like elegant and exacting. I like that. All right. This next poem is called Before All of This. I'm switching to the book. And as usual, Early summer seems already to hold inside it the split fruit of late fall, those afternoons whose diminished music will soon enough lie down in, surprised a little, to feel it all surprised. Meanwhile, how the wind sometimes makes the slenderest trees, still young, bend over, makes me think of knowledge conquering superstition. I can almost believe in that until the trees, like fear, spring back. Then a sad sort of quiet just after. That's between two people who have finally realized they've stopped regretting the same things. It's like they've never known each other. Yet, even now, waking, they insist they've woken from a dream they share, forgetting all over again that every dream is private. Whatever the reasons are for the dead underbranches of the trees that flourish here, that the dead persist is enough. For me, it's enough. The air stirs like history, like the future, like history. I have a group of poems scattered across this book of sort of types of people, um, uh, gladiators, surfers, things like that. This is Vikings. I think the screen is working. The Vikings thought the wind was a god, that the eyes were holes. A window meant a wind eye for the god to see with, and at the same time through. I used to hate etymology. What's the point? I'd whisper. I was quieter back then, less patient, though more easily pleased. I am pleased to have been of use, I used to say to myself, after sex with strangers. Leaning hard against the upstairs window, I'd watch them make their half-proud, half-ashamed-looking way wherever, and if it was autumn, whether in fact or only metaphorically, I'd watch the yard fill with leaves, then with what I at first thought was urgency, though it usually turned out just to be ambition. I'd leave the window open, as I do now. If closed, I open it, then pull the drapes shut across it, which, of the many I've tried, remains the best way I know still to catch a wind god breathing. I don't usually say much in between poems. I'm never quite sure what to say. So what I'm going to say is, here's the next poem. It's called Refrain. Refrain. My fortress has many windows. From this one, I can tell the tide's going out. I can see the small purplish flowers further up from the water that you never stopped calling sea thistle, though that's still not right. The ring of aspens that surround my fortress, that of course know nothing of east or west or love when scattered in all its countless definitions, form a natural palisade that, in leafless months, can seem especially severe, but somehow as well inviting. How forgiveness might look in the face, say, if it had a face, and forgiveness were real. My fortress is cold and windless. It's a choice not to step from it. I believe in gift as much, I think, as I believe in mastery. Even your mistakes were delicate. The title poem of this book is Scattered Snows to the North. And someone was asking me recently, where does this title even come from? I'll tell you the truth. It came from a weather report. I heard it somewhere on the radio or TV. There were scattered snows expected to the north. And I guess being a poet, assuming this is what poets do, I ran and wrote this phrase down thinking that could be a good title for something one day. And here it is. I thought it would just be the title of a poem, but now it's the title of a whole book. scattered snows to the north. Does it matter that the Roman Empire was still early in its slow unwinding into never again? Then, as now, didn't people burst into tears in front of other people or in private for no reason that they were willing to give, or they weren't yet able to, or for just no reason? I've never stopped missing you, I used to practice saying, from when I'd need those lines, as I assumed I would, given what I knew then, nothing really, about things like love, trust, the betrayal of trust, and a willfulness that's only deepened inside me all these years, during which I can almost say I've missed no one, though it hurts to say it. Honestly, the Roman Empire, despite my once having studied it, barely makes any sense to me now, past the back and forthing of patrolled borders as the gauge and proof of hunger's addictive and erosive powers. But there were people, of course, too, most of them destined to be unremembered, who filled in their drawn lives anyway, because what else is there, to where the edges gave out? If it was night, they lit fires, presumably. Tears were tears. I guess a little nod to the timelessness of suffering, which can be, I suppose, heartening in some strange way to know we're not alone. All right, here's another group of people, surfers. Probably this morning's surfers aren't that much different from the ones I used to watch nearly 50 years ago, whose glamour seemed so much more fixed, more absolute from a distance than when they got too close, which is the fault not of myth, but of turning people into myth. I was a kid then, and they were more or less men. Soon they'd be men for real, meaning more or less boys. They rarely smiled at me. They never touched me. They mostly pretended not to notice me, though one time, watching them from where I'd hidden in a stretch of dune grass, I could see a couple of them with hands raised to their eyes, scanning the dunes as if searching, and I stood up, unhid myself, and I could tell they'd missed me. Toward nightfall, I'm a lighthouse. I'm a lighthouse, I'd sing to myself, but very softly, because boys aren't lighthouses. That's nonsense. Repeat after me. I could never have guessed at it back then, this second life. It was all I could do, just to be patient, as they paddled their boards out again, into the waves. Then they'd catch one, and flashing my arms, extended in front of me like the twin beams of light that, softly, they'd always been also, I'd guide the men in, to shore, then closer, as if there were a choice that summer, or ever, and I'd chosen, and I could almost still see it from here. I had no idea when I was a kid watching surfers from a distance that they'd be in a poem sometime. Nor did I have any idea I'd ever be writing a poem, but here we are. It makes me wonder if there's much surfing off the coasts of England and Ireland and United Kingdom. I wonder. This is called Like So. From attention to adoration is a smallish distance, and yet no arrow, no boat with sail can cross it, like the mind's insistence. We'd reached the marshes by then that all the dead must come to. I could see my face, tilted there, like a solar eclipse viewed indirectly, which is the proper way in a basin of water. You must hold it steady, keep the basin safe from the wind's reach, its competing powers of revelation and distortion. Strangely enough, I learned about the watching of eclipses in a basin of water by watching a so-so TV show that imagined a very unlikely life of Emily Dickinson. It's kind of a comedy. But anyway, at some point, there's an eclipse. And apparently back then, in Dickinson's time, that's one way in which people would watch an eclipse in a basin of water. It's another way of seeing it without blinding yourself, I presume. I guess the moral of that story is that you can be watching a so-so TV show and it can still give you some information that's useful for a poem. All right. This is called Record of Where a Wind Was. Wave side, snow side, little stutter skein of plovers lifting like a mind of winter. We'd been walking the beach. Its unevenness made our bodies touch now and then, at the shoulders mostly, with that familiarity that, because it sometimes includes love, can become confused with it, though they remain different animals. In my head, I played a game with the waves called Weapon of Choice. They kept choosing forgiveness, like the only answer. As to them, it was, maybe. It's a violent world. These, I said. I choose these, putting my bare hands through the air in front of me. The next poem is called Fist and Palm. Sounds more violent than it is. Fist and palm. There are plenty who'd hardly recognize me now. I used to be that cruel, by which I mean I was frightened mostly, and now I'm mostly not. Joy, if only flickeringly, each day astounds me. The man I used to be dismounts, relents for a bit, before digging his boots, streaked with longing, my own longing, what I can't help, hard into my sides again, into the man I've become. His way of reminding me we've only stopped for rest, a short rest, some water. We've years to go still. He has his job. I have mine. Speechlessness is not an option, he whispers into my ear. He spits on the words themselves after, as if to make them stay, or just to make sure I'm listening. But I'm always listening, as I always obey. Isn't this obedience? These songs I've built from things too difficult to speak of. I don't know if that's obedience. I suppose that's why it ends on a question, because I don't know the answer. Uh, okay. And because I realize this reading might be less than 20 minutes, I feel like I should say something in between and buy some time. Okay, so I'll say something. That yeah, that the structure of this book is in 3 parts, and it's anchored in these narratives, 3 narrative poems, one of which I'll read as the final poem. And at the time when I wrote these poems, I thought this whole book would be a bunch of narrative poems. A narrative of these 2 people wandering through an unnamed landscape, and who knows whether they're lovers or not, or friends or strangers to each other. And anyway, there ended up only being 3, and I had this idea to anchor each section in that. And I think the idea is, and this ties in with what Seán was saying about the book, it very much is about memory and the untrustworthiness of memory, nature, sex, untrustworthiness of sex too, I suppose, and of love. And so the idea of this sort of narrative of people making their way across a life, but then the whole atmosphere of the rest of the book being these shorter lyric poems that sort of have memories and regrets and all of that. Okay, how was that for doing a sum up of my own book. Um, so I guess that's partly what it's about. All right, there are two poems left. This is called Gladiators. Each had been terrible to himself already, to that truest self inside, as only he could know it. So it seemed it should matter less what ways in particular they'd been terrible to each other, or even that they'd been terrible at all. Likewise, whether death mattered or not wasn't the point, had never been. They understood this now. Bird crossing sky, sky getting crossed, the sky after that. They believed about suffering that its special power is to define, even as it displaces it, everything it touches. They held on to each other. All right, I'm going to finish with this final poem, which, as I said, is a little more narrative. Although I'll just say, I actually believe all poems are narrative at some level, but I think there's story narrative, and then there are things like emotional narratives and psychological narratives, but those are other things. Okay, so this is the poem with which the book ends, Rehearsal. By then, the point of the forest was the getting through it. Then it lay behind them, all but its sharper details, flies licking at dried blood, I think, on a random tree stump, getting swiftly lost. Its muffled bird song, too, that had come less, it seemed, from the trees than from beneath, mostly, as if somewhere deep, deep inside the earth. Maybe meeting you has been the one good reason I lasted so long in a world that must eventually not include me, I almost said to him. Past the forest, the shore, where the land ended, where briefly the trees hitting it, the waves hitting it, seemed the latest example of how squandering momentum can become routine, while upon the waves, the taken for grantedness of shadow play seemed its own example, how one way to prove power can be to quietly assume it. Then, except for offshore, where the dark lay like, defiantly, a ship at anchor, everything was itself, as it always had been. They took off their clothes, their shoes. They swam out to the dark ship. All right, I reversed the order of those clothes and shoes, but that is the end of this reading portion. And so I'm thinking another square is going to pop up, and there it is. And it's going to contain Seán. It's going to beam in.
Hello,
Oh,
I'm back. That was brilliant, Carl. Thank you. I could have listened to you for ages. I wanted to start perhaps by quoting you back to you and
okay.
just you reflect on something. So I was reading over the past week again, My Trader's Mystery, which is Carl's book of well, Meditations from a Life in Writing is the subtitle. There was one part that I had in a past iteration of reading underlined all the way through, and so I wanted to pitch it to you,
Okay.
which is about revision. And one thing that I loved about this book and what I could see then in Scattered Snows to the North was the process of revision you describe in the book as well, you pass it as revision or re-seeing something
Mhm.
in the process of making a poem. And there's a part here where you describe the process of revision. Revision's a kind of cleaning up of my idiosyncratic path. The poem is something less idiosyncratic and with luck more useful. The poem is a map, but after the fact, not a way of getting somewhere, but a record of having been lost, of where that lostness brought me, until what was uncharted territory became for the space of the poem a place to live. And
Mhm.
I love this idea that the poem might be um, a record of lostness or a kind of map of lostness. Because it seems to me a different way of writing a poem to many poems that you might encounter, which seem subject heavy or thematic. You know, they might approach the idea of a poem about XYZ. Seems to me that with your poems, they find the subject as they continue to evolve and they emerge from association and meditation on an idea.
Yeah.
I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you go about retracing that lostness in a poem. How is it that you find these portals through which the language can move and become a poem? And how do you know when
Oh,
the place of lostness is charted?
yeah, huh. That's a hard beginning question. Good one. Um, it makes me think, oh, Carl, you say a lot of things, but do you really know what you're saying? Um, I mean, I do. I stand by what I said about revision, but I think, well, how does it? I think what it is, because it's true. I agree with you that many poems seem as if I get the sense the poet has decided to write about, you know, a journey. They went to, a party and they decided to write about the party. And I have a problem where I can't write that way. It made me a very bad student because as soon as I'm told what to write about, I just don't. Um, and so what I do is because I also can't really consciously sit down and say, I'm now going to write a poem. If I think that way, it doesn't happen. So I this will seem like an indirect way of getting to your answer, but like with these poems, maybe that I basically will just be doing random things, cooking, walking a dog, and I just have an idea or a word, and I think, okay, I'll put this in a journal and see what happens someday. And then maybe once or twice a month, I I sit there and sort of think, I wonder if I stare long enough at the phrases on this page and the words, if, maybe these two can go together. And so it becomes like building little steps. And once I put two things together, it reminds me of something that hasn't been written down, or it leads to another idea. So I truly feel as if I'm stumbling word or phrase by phrase towards something. And at the whole time, I haven't even thought I have an idea for a poem. Um, and And so often what happens is like, so then the poem finishes. I can feel to my mind, it feels like, okay, I think I've got something, but I don't look at it past that. And the next day, so I usually write at night. The next day, I'll look and it often will take a long time to title a poem because I really don't know what it's about, but I'll feel as if, I guess I should say part of why I think I write is this kind of it's like building a temporary wall between myself and what feels like the unbearable, which I know sounds overly dramatic, but I feel as if I'll be fine, happy enough, and then somehow sink into some world of like, what's the point? What is life about? What is love about? And somehow the mapping out as wandering around with words seems to build a kind of safety net or a wall between or something. Um, and so I don't know, first of all, is that even an answer?
Yeah.
It's how I get there. And but the problem is working that way is unpredictable. It's very intuitive. And uh, so unlike many people who will say, well, I'm working on a book and it's about this, or I have many friends who will say, I have three more poems to write and my book will be finished. Whereas I sometimes think the next poem I write could make me abandon everything I was writing before. So I'm kind of waiting for the poem to teach me what it is about, what it wants to say.
Yeah.
If
And
that's not too vague.
yeah, no, that's a great answer because I think it gets to the point of what I get when I read your poems is an idea that's almost too big to be articulated as a single idea inside a mind at any given time. So they
Hmm.
see like each idea steps into another idea and it extends that way rather than, one complete idea becoming a complete poem. There's a way of like a many-sidedness to the poems that perhaps comes from that deliberation. Um, and
Yeah.
you spoke to a little bit about the moment at which the book itself seemed to, it was originally seen as, or you thought it might just be narrative poems,
Mhm.
and then it developed in that way. And I think that's interesting to know that the book is kind of an evolving thing rather than a set idea. Perhaps those two are. are similar in the way that they work.
Yeah, I think I had in my mind that I'd written a whole bunch of narrative poems, and then when I sat down one day and I thought, I think I have enough poems that maybe could be a book. There were maybe 50 poems. It's usually how it is. There are 50, and I figure out of these, maybe I can get 30 that are worth putting in a book. And I thought, I don't know why I thought I was writing all these narrative poems. There are only three of them here. So even that, I like the surprise of like
Mm.
I might have had a vague idea of where I was going, but that turns out not to have been so. I also want to say too, I really like your example of the multifaceted. I mean, I often have described, well, at least my own poems, as like if you had a multifaceted jewel or something. And so how the light catches one particular facet, then you just turning it, it's this slight, and so if you imagine the facet to be something like memory or mortality, because I used to think I had very limited subjects. But then I thought, well, but they're big subjects that keep flashing into different meaning. And of course, how we think about memory at 20 is different from 60. And so there's a way in which sometimes I've been told nothing much happens in my poems, and I think that can be true. But on the other hand, I think, well, it's more like you're being asked to kind of consider this angle of approach. And now what about this angle? And about subjects that aren't resolvable. So how much can happen? You can't really get to
Yeah.
a conclusion.
Yeah. It's kind of a strange idea that nothing might happen in a poem as a criticism or as an observation. I think a lot happens in your poems for me, at least that there are moments that I noticed actually when you were reading then of uh, bits of speech or recollected speech or bits of speech that were unspoken and
Mm.
these sort of other voices that come into the poem. I wondered when I was reading your book, I was struck by, you're talking about memory and it was at the end of the Surfer's poem. There was a distance between the speaker, the younger speaker, the Surfers. Everything is kind of at removes and it's about pulling these things together. And when I was reading the book, I thought about the ways in which memory and desire, by which I mean kind of belonging or a kind of urge to get to something, were actually kind of two sides of a coin in some ways that
Hmm.
both reaching towards unreachable things or unrecoverable things, and kind of desire is kind of extinguished once you get something. So it kind of
Hmm.
really exists in the longing, and it made me think about the poem itself or your poems as kind of forms of desire. Does that kind of make any sense to the way that you write?
Yeah, it does, especially when you speak about, and I agree about desire is it's all in the longing. It's
Mm.
not about the getting in some ways, because then it's no longer you've got the thing. So, and I sometimes think of my poems as being I know they don't seem as if they're resolved in the end. I know that, but I like to think of a poem as an act of longing. And when I was speaking earlier about different kinds of narrative, one of the I'm most interested in psychological narrative. And so just the movement from sorrow to joy in a poem to me is something happening. That's a narrative, even though it may not be that you followed some people and they went to a restaurant and they ate a meal, and it's not that kind of narrative. Um, but yes, I do think of poems. I mean, I hadn't thought of it until you just said it, but it makes sense to me as acts of desiring, and and maybe that's why I feel this resistance to firm conclusion, because it's almost like not wanting to get there. As long as you don't get there, there's still something to get to.
Yeah, yeah.
Uh,
They seem uh well, as you said in that quote that I read, like charted spaces in which something can live
mhm.
without being violated by being concluded or kind of
Yeah, in some ways, I mean, not to I would not compare myself to Keats, but I do think of that negative capabilities situation that he writes of this, as I understand it, the poet being able to be at peace in some way with in the presence of a lot of unresolvable things going on. And I think that's how I feel about poems, that it's not about solving for X, but about sort of charting how does X behave? How do I feel about X today? And um,
Mm.
it's and sometimes I used to tell my students it's kind of like the difference between two types of movies. There's the kind where at the end you think, what the hell happened? And you for weeks you're talking with your friends about this movie. And then there are other kinds where there's no question. I mean, the person was killed or the people fell in love and got married or whatever. And there's a satisfaction in that kind of movie too. So, I mean, these are the only kinds of poems I can write, but I certainly like reading a good mystery novel, for example, where the case is solved by the end. But I don't think it's true to life. In real life, I feel as if we're constantly sort of thrashing around with who we are and what our bodies are, and I don't think it ever gets resolved.
Right, yeah. You've made me think of a film I never got, which was Inception. But the ending of that film, I don't know if you ever saw it. It
I
was
haven't, but I know what you mean. Yeah.
the very final scene of it was just a spinning top, and the
Mm.
spinning top carried on spinning, and then the film cut out. And
Mhm.
no one really knew what, well, I'm sure some people did knew what it was in reference to, but that idea of it not falling, at the end, you kind of knew it fell at some
Uh-huh.
point. It seems to me a good place to leave a poem
Yeah.
on that moment. It might be a good place to ask a question from the audience, because Alice Hiller, who is a brilliant poet in her own right,
Yes.
has asked about your relationship to Elizabeth Bishop's articulation of indeterminacy as a creative starting point, which might link in with what you were saying about Keats there, perhaps.
It might. Is so well, so I'm not going to, I'll just be honest. So is that so Elizabeth Bishop speaks of indeterminacy as a starting point for a poem?
I assume so, Alice. If you want to type any further context in, you'd be welcome to. But I
But
imagine it might be, yeah, I suppose, in Bishop's poems, there's those moments of self-correction or self there's one is it in the Moose? Where she has something like big as a house, and then in
yes.
brackets, or safe as houses. There's
Mhm.
kind of moments of is that I think that's what Alice is talking about. Indeterminacy as a force within her poems, Alice is saying.
Yeah. I think that's interesting because I mean in part I was going to say, well, I agree. Indeterminacy to me is another word maybe for lostness, of at least not knowing exactly you haven't determined a subject or a direction. Um, and and I think also that indeterminacy means you have more chances of being surprised into a different kind of knowing from what you expected. Because I think as soon as you've determined something, you sort of, put blinders on and head in that direction, as opposed to saying, let's see what happens. Um, it's kind of like you can be the typical American tourist who has it all planned out and with the guidebook and says this is what we have to do for the following day. Or you could just walk down a street somewhere in Dublin and say, let's just see what happens and let's fall into a restaurant that appeals. So I guess for me, indeterminacy seems very important in a poem. Though
As a
now I want to know more
discover,
about what Bishop says. Yes.
yeah, yeah. Julian Bishop is referring to when you were speaking about watching the eclipse in a bowl of water, which I loved. Um, you talked, Julian says, about watching the eclipse in a bowl of water and its competing powers of revelation and distortion. Um,
Hmm.
is that something that you would describe to the act of writing a poem? Are those properties something that revelation and distortion, something?
Yes. Because I do think that I guess at least these do seem competing powers. Because on one hand, a poem does, I think ideally, does reveal something to the maker of the poem, but with luck to other readers of it. Um, but there's a way in which I think to make a poem is to participate in distortion because I anyway, am taking random things that I've observed, and they didn't all get observed the same day. Um, but I'm now putting them into a context or relationship that they didn't have before. So there's a bit of deception. Um, and or it's like the distortion of in that surfers poem. It's a good example where there is truth to my having watched surfers in my preteen years quite a bit. Um, but have I ever played a game of hide and seek with them in the dunes? No. And so there's a way in which the kernel of truth gets distorted. So in that way, it's the way it's why I think poems are both autobiographical and true, and at the same time, they're our version of it. And maybe that leads back to the idea of memory in the book, because that's the problem for me with memory, that it can seem like it reveals things. You remember something and you think, oh, okay, now I understand a situation differently. But memory distorts so quickly, and you can feel certain that something happened a certain way until you talk to someone else who was in the room with you, and they have a very different idea of what happened. Um, so to me, it's the exciting thing and the sort of disturbing thing about poetry is its ability to reveal and distort.
Hmm. I wonder if this might be a difficult question, but I don't think anyone's ever asked me this, so I'm intrigued. But is there anything after having written the book, sat with the book, read it back to people now, that you that is revealed to you about your own work at a later date with some distance?
Oh, well, with this book, maybe not because it seems newer.
Hmm.
Uh, although, yeah, I don't know. Yes. First of all, I was going to say one thing that I happen to be in the process of doing is my very first book from 1992 is getting republished next year. And because it had gone out of print. And so what I have to do is type up the whole manuscript of this first book all over again because when I wrote it, we didn't have computers and or whatever form I have it on, it's on some disk that can't be played anymore. So I've been typing these poems that I wrote in the late 80s and early 90s. And it's very, in many ways, disturbing. It's in some ways I see things that to see technical things that I was already stumbling into figuring out how to do, how to make sentences. And so that's interesting. It's also strange to think about how I thought about certain subjects. So it's maybe it's the kind of weirdness of looking at an album, a photo album, and seeing yourself in points in your life that you've kind of not spent time thinking about. Uh, so there's that. And was that the question? How is it revealed? Like, have
Yeah,
I
I
looked at
suppose,
things and seen, did they say things to me that disturb me or
not
change me?
necessarily that they disturb or change you, but perhaps, you know, as an accumulation of your ideas and ways of thinking,
Yeah.
and you look at them all together. I just wondered if there was anything that you thought, ah, I think that a lot, all right.
Well, it is true. Like even looking in reading as I have been from this new book, I do find it has made me think, huh, you're one, in my mind, I'm somewhere around 42 years old, but I'm really 65. And so, as I believe is evident. And so, as I read these poems, I think, you've actually been spending a lot of time, Carl, like you sound like an older person. And then I'll realize, well, that's because I am an older person. Um, and it takes me aback a bit to think that I'm thinking in that way. Or I feel like the writing about sex, there's not that much of that in this book, but the writing about it sounds more weary to me. Like in that Vikings poem, it seems like, yeah, this is how it used to be and blah blah blah, as if as if that world is gone. And it's not gone in real life, but it's just interesting to see how I wrote about sex in my 30s and and how it is now to reflect back on some of those kinds of scenes.
Right. Yeah. I mean, this is a good place to bring in a question from Lisa Kelly. Also a
Oh,
great poet. You've got everyone here. Um,
I'm
Lisa's
glad all
asking
these poets
you,
showed up.
yeah.
Yeah.
Can you speak to the split in your poetry? By which she means your ability to find yourself lost in the forest, but look back and feel sympathy for your other, perhaps more impatient or less empathic self. So I
Oh,
suppose
wait.
the
So
kind of
what
what
is the question?
I suppose the question is maybe related to what you were talking about there in
Uh-huh.
terms of reading your earlier poems, but perhaps I think Lisa is saying in some of your poems you have earlier versions of yourself.
Hmm.
So there's a kind of split between Carls. And I think she's asking you just to speak a little bit more about that split between two selves and having
Sure.
to feel sympathy or empathy for an earlier version of of yourself within the poem.
Yeah. I guess it's one of the things that poems can be useful for, to sort of get some perspective on the self. And I hadn't really thought about the fact that I do that much, but I guess I do if I think about it. Which is one of the many things I like about Q&As is that you learn things about yourself. Uh, and I guess I guess what is there to say about it? Except, I mean, in something like Surfers, when you pointed out how there are these different levels of, I mean, there's the surfers, there's the memory of the surfers, there's the memory of the child self, but there's the me now remembering all of that. And I guess I guess what I hope in a poem is there's a way in which those are less split maybe than they keep overlapping. And I think that's maybe this gets to it. One of the things that I remain bewildered by is how when we're always carrying around our earlier selves. And so we're not usually conscious of it, but there's this way in which I can still taste something that I remember tasting for the first time when I was 5, but I'm 65. And so and it's and that's nice when it's something as pleasant as remembering a taste. It's another thing if you carry around something of earlier trauma, or um, something I've come much to be much more aware of now is the number of selves we seem to have all the time, not just chronological selves, but I spend a lot of time thinking about who I am in a relationship and who I have been in previous relationships. And so these splits and where I want to divide myself from those things, but I feel like they're always overlapping in some way. And sometimes I think that's one way I guess I could think of my own poems is that it's often this braiding between contemporary right now writer of the poem, person remembering an earlier self, remembering those people who shaped that self in some ways. And and the challenge to me is to not regret any of it, because I think it could be easy to regret earlier selves and mistakes, and rather than just sort of try to be objective and say, that's what happened, that's who I was back then, and I don't have to be ashamed or proud of it. But
Mhm.
I fear I've veered off the road of the answer, but
No,
that's
I
the
think you gave a great answer there. It seems to me that it's an interesting way of introducing into the poem a sort of um, a sense of a multiple or even perhaps I think unstable is the wrong word, but unstable sense of the speaker and the self being made up of so many different voices and memories and ways of articulating an idea.
yeah.
There's almost something I'm sure someone more well versed in theory or something than me would say something about hauntology and something going on in the way in which kind of these early
Mhm.
emerge within a poem um as a way of holding or conjuring up um the ghosts of a past self or something.
I think so. And I too don't know the theory of any of those things, but I feel like humans are very messy. We're very messy and we have all these parts of ourselves that we want to try to many of us try to compartmentalize, but they're always overlapping. And um it's it's been particularly interesting to I've moved back to Massachusetts, where I was from, and for a long time, and I've moved to the part of Massachusetts where I had a long relationship with somebody else who is now dead. But we broke up before he was dead. And but I'm here with my partner who I'm with now. And it's a very interesting thing to move, like to go to a restaurant that I know quite well from my time with somebody else, but I'm showing it for the first time to somebody in my life now. And I'm not that person I was 20 years ago, but it's almost as if that person's hovering in the rafters or something. And um, so I think that's maybe another way in which a poem can be a little rescuing, because for me, for a moment, it brings those various selves into a kind of constellation
Mm.
that makes sense.
Yeah.
And then we step into the world itself, and it's not a neat constellation. It's just random memories and selves.
Mm. Yeah, I mean it seems that that sense of familiarity with the place or a kind of a sense of home necessarily comes with associations like that.
Yes.
Is that something equally disturbing or more disturbing, I think, about going to a place that you have no association with and finding yourself there? That can be a strange place to be.
Yes.
Right. Does anyone have a final question for Carl? Because we are pushing on the hour.
Yeah, I assume Jazz will
Mm.
corral us when.
If not, I will ask a final question. I just don't want to hog you.
Okay.
Okay, I'll ask a question then. I wondered, the very first poem that you read and that opens the book,
Uh-huh.
has that line about the beautiful colors of extinction. And throughout the throughout the book as well, I noticed references that put into my head kind of ends of things. The Roman Empire,
Mhm.
Vikings, even, the kind of civilizational sense of endings, which might be not the lightest subject to end
Mhm.
the evening on. But I wonder if you had a sense, either consciously or looking back, of political concerns or anxieties kind of infiltrating the poems. Either was that a conscious thing, or is it something that you even recognize to yourself by making it up, or are those things in there to you?
In that poem, yes, I think, I mean, I put that poem first because when I first wrote the poem, I was thinking of the beautiful colors of extinction as in things like climate change, that kind of thing, and then mortality. And sometimes it seems odd to me that we can be doing something like getting ready to have sex with somebody, but meanwhile, the world is
Mm,
in chaos. And And so while I'm thinking, I remember thinking, well, while you're waiting to see what extinction looks like, these are the colors of it. What extinction looks like is this. You might be getting ready to go to bed with somebody, but you're both in the process of dying, just by fact of being mortals. And the weather is continuing as it is. But this poem has come to resonate for me more in a more political way, just with so many things happening, in particular, you know, decimation in Palestine and Lebanon and really around the world. And it can seem very strange to me that that can be happening while I'm wondering what to make for dinner, while I'm preparing to read for this. And it seems wrong in some ways. And but it's just how our world is. And I think we're just made more aware of it these days because of social media. It allows you to be able to scroll through Instagram, say, and see someone's new outfit, and then meanwhile a political message they have,
mm,
and meanwhile a funny thing that a rhinoceros did at the zoo. So the weird simultaneity of it is disturbing to me. But anyway, yes. So I think of the poem as referring to those political ends too, including really old things like the Roman Empire, but there's always empire somewhere that's crumbling.
Mhm. Yeah.
And then there's the empire of the body, and then there's the empire of our relationships with people, and they're all sadly doomed to end, which is why I guess we have to enjoy them while we have them.
Right. Yeah. And it's such a brilliant way of introducing multiple I don't mean perspectives, what's the word I'm looking for? Um, well, I suppose frames of vision. Yeah,
Mhm.
I suppose I do mean perspectives in terms of the macro and the micro existing together in a
Yeah,
complicated start of the book. Um, well, Carl, thank you very much.
I appreciate
Thank you to everyone for coming.